All right, well, good afternoon. This is a topic that is usually one of our most well-attended workshops. So I'm always happy to talk about salary negotiation. And today we're going to kind of walk through evaluating your offer, maybe evaluating competing offers, then different strategies for negotiating for more. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about how to graciously turn down an offer if you're not able to reach an agreement that's satisfactory to both parties. So in my preparation for this presentation and this workshop, and just in my salary negotiation research in general, I came across a study, and of course I didn't reference it here, but I'm happy to send it to anybody who's interested in reading more, that identified, or I guess, categorized different salary negotiation approaches and then rated both people's satisfaction with the process based on the approach that they used, and then also evaluated how successful they were in terms of, how much more money they were able to get. And the strategies were kind of on a spectrum. One being sort of the most adversarial, the competing strategy, where you're only trying to maximize your own outcome without, granting any sort of good faith on the other side. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the accommodating, where you're thinking about maybe the other party's concerns even more than your own. So the results were maybe in some ways surprising, maybe not. So those who chose to negotiate, unsurprisingly, were more successful and increased their average starting salary by an average of $5,000, which I thought was kind of surprising because that's not nothing, $5,000. Those who behaved competitively, so those who were the most adversarial, on average did eke out more money, but they were less satisfied than those who took a more collaborative approach with the process in general. So take from that what you will. And then those who were dragged over the finish line kicking and screaming into negotiation felt pretty unsatisfied with their results, which is unsurprising. And my very unscientific conclusion from all of that is that salary negotiation can be a lot less stressful and feel less mysterious if you assume good faith on both sides and treat it as a more collaborative process, that you're both trying to reach a satisfactory agreement. It's not in the employer's best interest long-term to squeeze as much labor out of you for as little money as possible, because that's a really poor retention strategy. So if you approach it as they're coming from their set of circumstances and restrictions, and you're coming from a position of advocating for yourself, but ultimately you both want to leave happy, and that's the goal of both sides, I find that it just takes a lot of the stress and mystery out of the process. But on the other hand, you are your only advocate in this process. So keep in mind that the salary that you accept up front is going to be the basis that any additional raises or cost of living increases will be based on. Any bonuses are all going to be a percentage of that initial salary. And although this is changing a lot, this could also affect your salary with future companies as well. Also, you never have more leverage for negotiation than when an employer has gone through the process of interviewing, reference checking, maybe background checking, and selected you against the backdrop of all of the other applicants as the most valuable. So you want to seize on that momentum. And while it can be tempting to bring your financial obligations and your debt into the negotiating process, that should really serve more as your own reference point for what you're able to accept on your end. So you wouldn't necessarily talk about that. Here is just an illustration of how that initial gap from someone who maybe didn't negotiate at $35,000 and someone who did negotiate at 39,000, how that compounds with a first year bonus, a 3% increase in the second year, and then a second year bonus. So again, while it doesn't seem like that's that big of a deal to go from only a $4,000 difference to a $4,400 difference, that's only going to compound and get worse over time, or I guess better for the person who negotiated. We're going to talk a lot today about doing research ahead of time, even before your interview, and setting your own floor and ceiling before the interview. But the negotiation process really shouldn't happen until there's a job offer in play, mainly because neither side should be engaging in negotiation until you've both gotten all the information you want out of the other party. So you want to make sure that you've evaluated the entire job. They want to make sure that they've evaluated you as an entire package of a candidate. So that doesn't mean that you won't talk about salary at all before the offer phase. I'm a big fan of employers who are transparent, especially if they have a very rigid range that they're only able to offer, so that you can both decide if it makes sense to move forward. And some employers will do that. And of course, some employers that you might be interviewing to be a part of have public salaries. But there are some individuals and organizations that still take what I think is kind of a dated view that the applicant themselves should never talk about salary before the offer phase. So just something to keep in mind. So before forming an opinion about your offer, I think really before you even go into a formal interview is to do your research not only about your industry, but about that organization specifically, taking into consideration the geographical location, their size, and any other thing that might be unique about that particular organization that might set them apart from your industry. And even throughout the interview process, you want to make sure that you are asking lots of questions and being really observant and kind of keeping that salary in the back of your head. You know, the more questions that you ask, the more you find out about the role and not just the role, but skills, experiences, unique assets that you might have that they did not list in the job description that you can then make explicit that you have. The more you ask questions, the more you learn about what the other party values, and the more you can make sure they know that you have those things. And again, you know, I mentioned that you don't want to bring your financial obligations or your debt or any of your needs into the negotiation. That should play a significant role in what you have decided is what your base is, what the lowest that you can accept is. This particular paycheck calculator is on Paycheck City, and so it'll do a really kind of basic calculation based on local taxes, any state taxes, and then you can go in and adjust the any withholdings so that you can get kind of a ballpark figure of what your net salary will be based on the gross monthly. So you want to make sure and think about like what your ideal is, what your absolute dream salary would be for this particular role. You also want to think about what your absolute bottom is in terms of what you can accept, and then pad that by, you know, at least a few $1,000s. I'd say maybe $5,000. I'd say even take what you're willing to settle for and add a few $1,000s on top of that as well. Here are some resources where you can research salaries, industries. This starts kind of global and general and big and kind of gets down to the local and the very specific to LBJ career outcomes data. And of course, all of the salaries for anyone who works for any state of Texas department, including anyone who works for UT, those are all public in the Texas Tribune, which I think is really handy, especially when you combine that with the fact that I can supply you with pretty specific career outcomes salary data by sector. So you can see what an average state government salary is for an LBJ grad. Then you can look up, say you find from maybe 2018, even 2019, you can look up what that person, if that person's still employed, with that organization, what their salary is now, and that can give you useful information about salary raise potential. It can also kind of give you a ballpark for what to expect in that process. And I'm just checking in the chat real quick. Yes, Jessica, I will be posting this. We're recording it now, and I'll be posting both the slides and the recording in Canvas. And some of the stuff that I'm going to share, some of the resources are already in Canvas, and I'll share with you the link for where those are. Just a moment. Okay. And then some more informal research tools. We've got the Occupational Outlook Handbook online, which is ONET. And I think that the link for that is just onetonline.org, which I find is a really useful tool for career exploration in general. If you're maybe thinking that your interest is really niche, or you have a set of skills and experience that you're having a hard time finding what the right placement is for you, ONET is a really fun resource just to learn about all of the different kinds of occupations that are out there. Talking to friends in the industry, and maybe even more specifically, recent grads and alumni who are working for the organization that you are, or who are in the geographic location that you are. I'm actually doing a similar workshop for this, but more Washington, D.C. focused on Friday. So I'm talking to a lot of alumni that can kind of give me some insight into what navigating a job search in that city is. You guys have heard me say this a lot, but our alumni are such a valuable resource. And although some people might be a little bit more traditional, and you might not be able to say what was your starting salary, what's your salary history, you can certainly get advice about things that different negotiation strategies that might have helped them in the past, or maybe different things that are negotiable in their industries that might not be in others, so that you have an idea of where you can push back and maybe where you can't. So 4 overall tips: probing for signs of flexibility, kind of along the same lines as asking lots of questions and being really observant about the process and identifying ways that you can add value that maybe are less explicit than in the job description. Also probing for signs of things that you could negotiate on, say if there is a really rigid salary structure. So maybe something like, maybe you can negotiate for additional stipends for professional development, or other non-monetary forms of compensation. Taking a long-term perspective, especially when you're evaluating competing offers, finding out as much as you can about different raise and promotion potential at both organizations. And then get pragmatic, make a pros and cons list, create a scoring system. And one of the things I'm going to share with you is an offer evaluation matrix that we have posted to Canvas that can help you both identify or compare competing offers, but also identify things that might be more important to you than, say, base salary that you might want to negotiate on, or at least identify in the benefits package. And then as you're probing for signs of flexibility, demonstrating flexibility, both demonstrating your value in terms of what your labor is worth, but also what your values are, so that an employer could potentially identify something that they didn't realize they might be able to sweeten the pot for you with. Okay, hopefully this is easy, but why don't you put in the chat whether you think this is true or false. You should accept the first offer to show enthusiasm and passion for the job, like right then and there. I like that, Tanya. No with an extra O is correct. Yes. I don't know if anybody has actually gotten this advice, but you're all right, it's false. I think sometimes, especially when you're starting a new career, that first post-graduation job search, you're so set on the goal of getting an offer that when you do get one, it just feels like overwhelming, and you just want to ride that feeling and say yes, and just don't. Even if it seems perfect, even if you're super excited, take at least a couple of hours to think it over. No one should be offended if you don't perform the appropriate amount of excitement, because you want to make sure you understand everything about the offer, ask all of the questions that you want to ask, and making sure that you are running that offer by more experienced people in your network. Again, you're going to be your best advocate here. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask lots of questions, again, lots of information. And, taking a few days to deliberate is totally normal. I think maybe beyond a few days, if you're going beyond like 4 days, you'll want to be as explicit as you're able to about why you need that time to think it over. Maybe you need to talk it over with your partner. Maybe you're waiting on another offer. Those are things that you might want to weigh if you're going to ask for more deliberation. Because remember, the employer has gone through as lengthy of a process as you have, lengthier probably, as they've interviewed more people and gone through different checks. And so assuming good faith, you want to be gracious in not stretching it out any longer than is absolutely necessary. So let's talk a little bit about benefits. Benefits can comprise 40% or more of your total compensation package. So you want to make sure that you are as informed as possible about what those benefits are and how competitive your organization is based on your industry. This particular calculator is on salary.com. I always think it's really helpful to look at the base salary and then the total compensation package, because that can vary quite a bit and can also put some things in perspective for you, especially in terms of healthcare coverage. If you, depending on how much of that you're responsible for paying out of pocket. So a couple of base questions to ask in particular about health insurance and PTO. Again, how much of that is coming out of your paycheck? How much of that might be coming out of your paycheck for any partners or children? When do you get to start taking advantage of that coverage? And also, when do you start accruing your PTO? It's a good idea also to understand the difference between benefits and perks. Benefits are part of your compensation, and so those are things that it could be negotiable. Perks are things that an employer does to improve employee morale, to ultimately improve employee productivity, and are less likely to be negotiated. And I'm going to kind of skip over the next few slides, but I just want you guys to know that they are available on Canvas. I am not a benefits expert by any means, but this is kind of a layout of some benefits that you might see as part of your package. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat where you can find both the slides and some other resources that I'll talk about. So just some different things that you might want to take advantage of. And I'm sorry if I'm going through these quickly. Again, the extent of my benefits experience, I'd just be able to read the slides to you, and I want to be more respectful of your time. So important, again, to review all of the benefits offered. We have students that come to LBJ from all different experience levels, age levels, so you're going to take advantage of different programs, and some that might be deemed incredibly generous for your industry or for your organization, or things that you wouldn't even take advantage of. So it's not as big of a pot sweetener as it might be for someone else. Okay, so this is the decision-making matrix that we created last year, and that's also available on that Canvas page. But again, something to identify maybe different things that you didn't think of that were really important to you going in that are not just base salary, and how those combine maybe with additional offers. Okay, another true false. You should always try and negotiate, because otherwise you're leaving money on the table. What do y'all think? kind of a trick question. I like the hedging. Yes, Janet. So here's the thing. I'm never going to tell you not to negotiate, but some things to keep in mind that maybe always is not the right answer is, again, just the assumption of good faith on both sides. Like, one example of a time where you might not want to negotiate is if they ask you for your salary requirements, you tell them, I am really looking to go $55,000 to $65,000, and they come back with $72,000 and have addressed all of the things that you need. It might not look great for you to go back and negotiate just for negotiation's sake. So those are just things to think about. If they're offering an exceptionally generous package for the industry, for their organization, they're sending you a message that they really want you, and you always want to start off on a good foot. Again, I'm never going to tell somebody not to negotiate, because I'm sure that there are people who have taken that approach and been successful with it. But again, just some things to think about in this process, that it's not always as straightforward as it might seem. All right, so a couple of do's and don'ts. Make sure that you're really careful with the lowest number of the salary that you give. Make sure it's not just a number that you can live off of, but one that you'll actually be happy with. Yes, maybe you'll be happier with $5,000 to $10,000 more, but you want to approach this as, this is the employer that I'm going to be with for the next 2 years, and I don't want to be miserable or have any reason to think that I'll leave earlier. Be careful with the top of your range as well. Not because you shouldn't be advocating for yourself, but if I'm hiring for a role where the absolute most I can offer is $60,000, and that's for the most qualified, perfect candidate, and somebody says, I want $60,000 to $75,000, I might worry that I can't keep them happy. So just be careful with not seeming out of touch. You want to make sure that you don't get too specific until you have all of the information possible. I'm a big fan of being positive and not adversarial and assuming good faith. I think it just takes a lot of stress out of the situation. And I hope this goes without saying about any part of the interview process, but don't lie at all in the interview process. Don't lie about a previous salary in hopes of making yourself more expensive. It's really easily verifiable. But we will talk in just a minute about what to do if you are asked about your salary history and you don't feel that that's a fair representation of your current value, because that happens a lot, right? You all are in kind of an intensive 2-year specialized training. So you're obviously going to be worth more than your most recent full-time salary pre-LBJ. Don't over-explain. You guys are being very well trained right now on how to be very concise but impactful with your language, and that's something that you should take into consideration here. And then, of course, don't feel like you were unsuccessful if you don't end up with like your target salary. If you're happy with the salary that you end up accepting, that's successful. Or if you only, maybe you ask for $10,000 more and you only get $5,000 more. Again, anything that both parties walk away happy with is successful. So don't let that breed resentment. Okay, so if you're asked to provide your salary history, there are a couple of approaches that you can take. You can always disclose it if you are comfortable with that and if you think that would be helpful. Or if you're interviewing in a jurisdiction where an employer is not allowed to base their salary offer based on your previous salary requirements, you can deflect, say, oh, you probably didn't know, but I think that there's a new law that actually puts that question out of bounds. But I'm happy to talk about my salary requirements. Or you can be perfectly honest and say, my previous salaries don't reflect my current qualifications. I've just completed a Master of Public Affairs with the LBJ School, where I got 2 years of research and internship experience in these particular skills, and just move it along to what to what your target is. If you're asked upfront about what your salary requirements are, here is some verbiage that I think is helpful. I would also add to this that you are looking forward to learning more about the role that can help you give a more precise answer to that question. So my research indicates that the typical salary range for this is this. You know, in light of the fact that I speak Spanish, French, and Arabic, I just got my Master of Public Affairs degree, and I've got 3 years of international experience. This is what I'd be looking for, but I am looking to learning more about the role so that I can give you a more precise answer. Here's some additional negotiating language. If we were in person right now, I would ask you to pair up and practice saying some of these things, because I think that just having kind of the muscle memory of actually saying them can be more helpful. I won't actually put you guys in breakout rooms to practice, but I think the important thing is to find, again, the concise, impactful way of saying, this is what I'm worth. That's it. You don't have to hedge with lots of, you know, I'm so excited about this offer and thank you so much. You do want to include some of that, but then you can move on directly to, you know, based on what I'm bringing, this is more of what I was looking for. And if you can do that, I'd be thrilled to accept. All right, so if you're not able to come to an agreement, taking the collaborative approach, you want to make sure that I'm going to go backwards here and go 3, 2, 1. Be as prompt as you can. Again, if you are waiting on your first choice offer, you get a second choice acceptance, and you're not going to get that first choice for 2 weeks. Being either very honest with them about why you would need the extra time, or, you know, taking your chance and letting them know and being prompt about pulling yourself out of that process, if that makes sense. I think what I'm trying to say is that don't unnecessarily drag the process along if the chances of you accepting that offer are very, very low. Because although you might not want that particular offer with that organization now, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't want to work with them later. That doesn't mean that you won't run into this person again in your career. So just demonstrating grace in this process is a skill, and it's something that can reflect well on you even as you're turning the offer down. Showing appreciation and being courteous of the time that it took for them to not only get to know you, but explain everything about the organization and the position, and just keeping in mind that every interview process is a networking opportunity. So you always want to leave that on a positive end. Even going into the process, if you know, I'm pretty sure that this isn't for me, I'm going to take this interview just in case. And then after the first interview, you know it's not for you, pulling out and thanking them for their time. So, are there any questions? And I know I went through that stuff kind of quickly. And again, skipping over some of those benefit slides that are on, sorry, where are you? That are on Canvas along with that offer evaluation matrix. Okay.
Yeah, I had a question, and I came a little late, so I don't know if you went over it, but I was thinking specifically about relocation expenses and where that fits into negotiating your salary.
That's a really good question. I would say that could potentially come up at different parts of the interview process. I think the key is being very upfront that you are in Austin and that you will have to relocate to Chicago. And if that is a deal breaker for you, again, being upfront about that as soon as you can. You know, if you have a little bit of wiggle room, then I would say you're going to wait until the job offer stage. But again, I think one of the mistakes that some people make is thinking that they won't get an interview if they don't list Chicago as their address. and then bring up relocation expenses after they get the offer. So I think being upfront that you are relocating for the job is the first step. And then I would feel out after that how comfortable you are bringing that up before the offer stage. I think the best thing you could probably do is if you know anybody who works for that organization, again, or if you have an alumni contact in that organization, and finding out what if they were offered relocation assistance, how common it is at that organization. I think Tanya, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I just had a question about, and maybe this is a little bit more uncertain, but just thinking about like COVID and kind of unemployment going on. How do you kind of handle I guess it's like the uncertainty of being like, can I reject a job offer if it's like not something I'm super in love with? And like, how often is it the case that like people get multiple job offers in a time period where you can evaluate them all at the same time instead of just hoping another one comes along that'll work for you? Maybe that's kind of hard to answer, but just like tips on how to think through that consideration.
That's a good question. I think there are a lot of things that you'd have to think about given the uncertainty. Knowing how much your industry or your sector has been affected by COVID is probably the first step, right? Because that'll give you some indication of how challenging it might be to get a second offer in your desired industry, but also how not excited are you about it. I think it's a dangerous game to accept something just because it's there and you're scared about nothing coming out, with the plan that you'll just jump as soon as you find something better. But trying to think of how to phrase this adequately. I guess, it depends. I think it's a personal thing that you'll have to evaluate based on what you know about that industry and getting as much info as you can. In terms of how many students or how often it happens that students get multiple offers, it happens. I think it happens more commonly with organizations and industries that have like a dedicated recruiting arm, because they all tend to follow the same recruiting patterns. And so they all end up, doing interview processes at the same time and doing offers at the same time, kind of because they're competing with each other for a lot of the same students. So it does happen. I wish I had a better answer for you on the best ways to walk through that. Having an offer that you're not super excited about, but being worried that might be the only thing coming along because of an uncertain time.
Yeah, no, I know it's a difficult question. I think what you mentioned about like the jobs that I'm looking at don't necessarily have recruiting cycles, so that definitely is a consideration for me. So yeah, I know there's no answer for this, but I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Well, and we can always talk about that too, one-on-one. That's like maybe more specific to what you're looking at, and maybe build a strategy around how to kind of build a plan A career search, plan B career search, and then God forbid, plan C career search, so that you're kind of set up with those like that plan in place, or at least like steps and a system to evaluate different offers through.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Daniel?
Hi. So maybe I'm extrapolating on the definition of a negotiation, but is it to be avoided at all costs to have some sort of a back and forth, almost like a street market bidding process for the salary? Or should it be just like a one-time consideration and then say that you'll come back at a later time? Or is it okay to do it in the moment and go back and forth between the salary you negotiate?
So if I'm understanding your question, you're asking like, do you get one shot to negotiate after the offer, or can you go back and forth?
Right, yes.
I mean, it definitely depends on the situation. I think there are situations where, you could go back and forth, especially if what you're asking for, they're like, oh, I'm really sorry, we're very rigid, this is the absolute highest salary we can offer. Then I think that gives you an opening to come back and say, well, I'm also willing to look at extended PTO, maybe relocation costs, different things that you would be willing to negotiate on, as would the employer be able to go back and forth. So, it's not something to avoid at all costs, the going back and forth. I think just, again, having gone through the interview process and listened for areas that might be flexible and kind of taken cues from your interviewers and talking to people who work at that organization to kind of suss out all of the things that might be negotiable if they can't budge on the original thing that you want and you're still interested. I think when I say bad faith or not wanting to go back and forth and negotiate just for negotiation's sake, is that if they're negotiating in good faith and give you everything that you ask for, it doesn't look great to then go back and look for more or ask for more.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Tanya.
Yeah, thanks. I just had another question. How much does asking for time off in the beginning of, but before starting a job, weigh into like your negotiation process? Is it the case that if you want like several weeks off, like you're gonna probably settle for not pushing so hard on like the salary part of it, or are they kind of separate discussions?
This also depends on how senior you are, because the more senior you are, the more senior role they're hiring for, the more likely you have standing to push back, or not push back, evaluate or negotiate for both. And it also depends on how generous their package is and what is most of value to you. So not necessarily mutually exclusive, more likely to be somewhat mutually exclusive the more junior you are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
I know some of these answers are not very satisfying, but a lot of this is dependent on how strong your qualifications are, the organization themselves, which is why it's a really good idea to get information from the source, both through the interview process and talking to other representatives from that organization. Isabel.
Yeah, so I have another question that's probably not going to have a simple answer. But I mean, a lot of this I feel like is targeted at American companies, but do you have any thoughts on like if you're trying to negotiate with an international company? I'm sure that also there needs to be, like some case by case like research done, but do you have any, I guess, idea on that?
I will be completely honest, I do not. Everything that all of my understanding and knowledge about salary negotiation is based on US customs. But that's a really good, I'm gonna take notes on that because that's a really good thing for me to find is resources for those companies or those different customs. We do have a software called InterStride that is geared towards international students navigating a job search both here in the US and in their home countries that might be helpful for domestic American students. I will look into that and I will see what I can find about other countries. We used to use a software called Going Global that had a little bit more emphasis on job searches in other countries, but I'm sure that there is something that I can find. So thank you. Are there any other questions about salary negotiation? And of course, you can always email me at LBJ Careers if you have a question that's specific to your job search and your circumstances. All right, well, thank you all for attending. I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording.